This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. Right now we're still in between a couple of formats. We're in between Baldur's Gate and Dominaria United. Dominaria United's spoilers, previews will begin in earnest this coming week. So we have that to look forward to. And one of the really interesting things about preview season, as a limited player is, seeing the early signs of what the limited archetypes might be. So in general, I thought this would be a good time to sort of look at a broad topic instead of one focused on a limited format because we don't really have one right now. And I wanted to talk about 10 limited archetypes that I think are the best in the sense that they were, at least when they were introduced, original, powerful, and pretty interesting takes on various archetypes. Now, I do want to say, the way we think of limited archetypes today is different than used to be the case. Today, we expect these signpost uncommons and these very usually synergistic interactions between various cards in a particular color pair. And believe it or not, that's actually a fairly recent thing when it comes to limited magic. That first showed up in 2013's Theros, I think, was the first time we had signpost uncommons straight up. So this video is going to focus on archetypes since then, basically, because before that, there were certain interactions between things like, blue-white skies is the famous old school archetype. Those are the two colors with the most flyers, so it made sense. Meanwhile, black and red often had the best removal. You'd often end up in sort of a control deck. White, green have the best creatures. That was usually some sort of aggro deck. But there wasn't the kind of synergy we expect today, and for that reason, I'm not talking about formats from before 2013. We did occasionally see more synergistic things like in Original Ravnica and stuff. Like Original Ravnica was constructed in a lot of ways like we expect modern limited formats to be, but none of those color pairs made this list, mostly because they weren't nearly as cohesive and interesting. I mean, you still had Boros basically just being an aggro deck. There wasn't really a mechanic and things like that. So I wanted to sort of limit it to more recent limited formats because that makes sense to do, because this is the time when we have these more cohesive archetypes. So let's get to the list of the 10 best limited archetypes, in my estimation, based both on how interesting they were and how powerful they were. So at number 10, I have Black-Red Treasure from Forgotten Realms. So this one probably would have been higher if they didn't keep giving us more treasure decks in other formats, and if we hadn't just had Baldur's Gate where they just sort of retreaded this exact same archetype. But when it first came out, this black-red angle for Treasure Matters that Kalain and much of other cards in the set represent was pretty original, and it was an interesting way to do treasure, like making it so if you spent treasure to cast this, X happens. It might seem like a small thing, but that was actually sort of a big new idea that made the archetype pretty interesting. It was also fun that the treasure deck had sort of a sacrifice sub-theme, and that is often what Black-Red has. It's, a lot of color pairs have sort of a typical limited archetype that you expect to see. Black-Red Sacrifice is kind of one of those that we see all the time, and that was still here, but treasure was front and center, and I think it was really cool, Kalain making your creatures bigger. The problem this archetype had in the end was just that it was way better than everything else in the format, and it was a problem that was further amplified by the fact that because you're a treasure deck, you could just splash everything. So there's a lot of downsides, but in terms of it making its debut and being unique and interesting at the time and powerful, I thought it deserved to be on this list. At number 9, I have Black-Green Toughness Matters. So this is in particular from Crimson Vow, so a relatively recent release again. The signpost uncommon here was Ancient Lumberknot, and the Lumberknot's okay, but it wasn't actually the big payoff for this particular deck, which was about high toughness. It was good, obviously, it made your high toughness creatures hit harder, but some of the more interesting things in the deck generally involved utilizing the Catapult Captain, who can sacrifice things and do damage equal to their toughness and things like that. And this archetype wasn't nearly as sort of widespread throughout the format as most of the others on this list. it was in some ways more of like a build-around type deck because there were, you were usually a black-green deck and you happened to have 5 or 6 cards that did a thing with high toughness. But I still thought it was so successful as an archetype, partly thanks to there being a 113 in the format, and there being enough toughness payoffs that, this is a color pair that I really look back on fondly, one of the more unique things they've done. They tried to do toughness matters before, by the way. I guess maybe that's a topic for another video, is failed limited archetypes that just didn't come together. Like in one of the Ixalan sets, green-white was supposed to be toughness matters. It kind of failed. A time where I guess it did succeed, actually, is Khans of Tarkir, where they also had a toughness matter theme, and Abzan in particular did, but the toughness matters in Crimson Vow, to me, was a lot more interesting than anything we saw in Khans of Tarkir, and it was a pretty legit archetype when you got the right pieces. At number 8, I have Green-White Coven, which is from Midnight Hunt, and Dawnheart Warden was the signpost uncommon. So this is a sort of a riff on a really typical archetype, which is like green-white aggro, go wide. Dawnheart Warden pumps all your creatures. What's so cool about that? Well, I think the Coven mechanic was a neat innovation to make that kind of deck more interesting. If you're just like making creature tokens or curving out and then playing Dawnheart Wardens and that's all there is to it, it's not nearly as interesting. But they managed to construct a pretty interesting deck using this Coven mechanic where you really do care about cards that have different powers. And so that sort of changed your draft. It could even change your pick order. If you have enough Coven payoffs, it would really change what you're doing. Cards that make 2 bodies of different sizes, like the 0/4 who makes a 1/1 and has a Coven effect on its own, were extra interesting because of the deck. So, Coven, it is also a cool flavor mechanic because they were trying to sort of communicate reaching the critical mass you need for, a magic spell if you're a witch or whatever. And so I thought it was really well executed. I mean, the deck wasn't at all the best deck in Midnight Hunt, but it was a perfectly viable one. There were enough Coven payoffs and enough of it going on in enough ways, variety of ways to turn Coven on, that I thought it was a really well executed take on green-white aggro, an archetype we see all the time, but this was one of the more interesting sort of spins on it. At number 7, I have Blue-Black Reanimator from M21. Obsessive Stitcher was the signpost uncommon here. So we see Reanimator decks reasonably often in limited formats, but 90% of them fail. 90% of them just don't work as a cohesive deck. You might have a little bit of a sub-theme, but it's not like what your deck is doing. But that wasn't the case for Blue-Black Reanimator in M21. You had Obsessive Stitcher, first of all, who came with a powerful loot effect, an effect you already like to have, but it also loaded the graveyard for its other ability, which allowed you to reanimate a creature from your graveyard. The deck actually had a reasonable number of other ways to load up your graveyard and reanimate things, and it had cards that just helped you load up the graveyard. The most notable of these was the huge whale that you could effectively cycle away early for some card selection, and then you could reanimate it as early as like turn 4, which was pretty insane. You also had the 4-mana 3/4 that let you either sack a creature or discard a card when it entered, and if you did, you drew a card, and you could use that to load your graveyard. And there were just a lot of good reanimation targets at lower rarities throughout the set. So it was a surprisingly well-executed Reanimator deck, and I don't think we've really seen a successful one as successful before or since. We just had Baldur's Gate, which had a reasonable one in the black-green deck, but it wasn't anything like this one, which was one of the more powerful decks in the format, and also it's just cool to play an actual Reanimator deck in a format, mostly with commons and uncommons, because that's just not something you normally do outside of cube drafts where you have like way more powerful ways to do stuff. But this format had a very cohesive Reanimator deck that I think was a lot of fun and also really powerful. At number 6, I have Blue-Red Big Spells. This is from Strixhaven. In particular, it was the Prismari. That's what Blue-Red is in Strixhaven. You had a lot of different cards that paid you off for this because this was a set all about 5 color pairs. So you had a bunch of gold cards in it. And, the main signpost uncommon, I guess, is Maelstrom Muse. But there were a whole bunch of other big spells and stuff too. And I thought this was really cool. It's another deck that used Treasure, but it wasn't really a Treasure deck. For the most part, it was just a blue-red ramp deck, which isn't something we see most of the time, but they found a way to make it work here, with treasure being one of the big ways that the deck could ramp. But then you had all these cards that would make your expensive spells cheaper, like the Muse or the 3-mana 2/2 flyer. So yeah, we see ramp decks all the time. Usually though, they're like blue-green or green-something in most limited formats. But here you had a legitimate ramp deck in blue-red, which I thought was really cool. And the flavor also worked. It didn't feel out of place because you're casting big spells. It's instants and sorceries. Those are the things you're ramping into. It's much harder to ramp into other things in the format. So it felt uniquely like a blue-red version of ramp. And, that was a really cool archetype. And not one I would mind seeing again, because I thought it was really interesting. At number 5, I have Blue-White Historic from our last visit to Dominaria. So I thought the historic mechanic in general was pretty cool. Our visit to Dominaria last time was really all about revisiting the history and what has changed. We hadn't been to Dominaria in forever, and we hadn't seen a lot of these characters or their descendants in forever. And so they added this historic mechanic, and I thought it was cool that it counted multiple different things that made sense. Like, what makes something historic? Well, an artifact, because, by their nature, they're supposed to be old things, right? Legendary creatures, because they represent important people in the history of a plane, and sagas, which tell the history of the plane. So these things being historic was cool. It was this cool sort of natural way to combine these three sort of disparate types of cards that are all pretty big themes in the last time we visited Dominaria into one interesting, cohesive archetype. And I thought, Wrath Capuchin is the signpost here. It lets you play historic things with flash, which was pretty cool. But it was actually something spread throughout the set, especially, I think, in the Esper colors. And I just think Wrath Capuchin was the more powerful, more interesting one of the group. And so it was a cool deck. I don't know whether we'll see it return again in this visit to Dominaria, but it's possible. It would be a mechanic coming back. I don't think it was super popular outside of Limited, so maybe it's not going to happen, but I did like it overall. At number 4, I have the black-white deck from Kaldheim, which was a second spell deck. In other words, you wanted to cast 2 spells in a turn, and you got some bonus. Furia was your signpost uncommon. She would let you draw extra cards and load up your graveyard if you managed to cast 2 spells. And this is another one, we've seen decks that care about casting multiple spells before, but putting it in black-white was really interesting. So you normally wanted this deck to be pretty aggressive with a low curve, and you wanted to be playing out these sorts of cards that gave you bonuses, because you wanted to play as many spells a turn as possible. So Furia was usually at the very top of your curve, and then you'd be playing like 1 mana, 1/2 flyers and stuff like that, and getting bonuses off them, like making 1/1 flyers or putting counters on them, or with Furia, drawing extra cards. And this sort of really low-to-the-ground black-white deck, it's just not something we see in most limited formats. Black-white is very rarely an aggro deck that has mostly 1 and 2 drops in it, but it worked here, and it was, an interesting way to get extra value out of casting these spells. And Furia was also just a cool signpost uncommon in what her effect was. The downside about her was you did have to be kind of careful not to mill yourself sometimes, but most of the time you could win the game before that mattered. But you don't have a choice. You do end up having to throw a bunch of cards in your graveyard in a hurry, but usually you'll win the game first. And so, I thought black-white was a unique and powerful archetype in Kaldheim. At number 3, I have Blue-Green Snow from Modern Horizons. The very first Modern Horizons. Your signpost uncommon here is Abominable Tree Folk, which has power and toughness equal to your snow things, and it taps something down when it comes into play, which is always an effect I love. This might not seem that unique or anything to us at this point, but it was the first time Snow was a legitimate archetype in any format. So Snow originally debuted back in Ice Age, which was one of Magic's earliest sets, but there wasn't a Snow deck. First of all, Ice Age wasn't a design for Limited at all. It wasn't on people's minds at all. That would come later in the history of Magic. Then, 10 years later, they did release Cold Snap, a set that also had Snow that was sort of the conclusion to Ice Age block 10 years later. And again, it wasn't really a deck. It was just a theme sort of spread throughout all the colors. This is before we really had limited archetypes the way we think of them today. So when Modern Horizons came out and was pushing snow on you, it was the first time we'd seen it since Cold Snap, and it was the first time we ever saw it as a real limited archetype in the way we think of modern design these days. And that was really cool. The value you could get out of all the snow stuff was quite powerful. One of the things I love the most about drafting snow decks in any format is you start to consider snow basic lands as serious pickups and snow dual lands as even more serious cards that you want to take. Because if you're playing with snow lands, snow payoffs, you have to get the snow lands in the draft. You can't just put snow lands in your deck when you build your deck. You have to get the snow lands, and this makes for a really interesting decision making. Now, we saw snow return in Kaldheim later on, and that was cool too, but I'm including the blue-green snow deck from Modern Horizons because it was the first time we ever saw it, whereas Kaldheim was sort of following up on that. The unfortunate thing is that snow was super pushed in Modern Horizons and sort of warped, modern constructed. But, that doesn't matter for us here in Nizzanotes. What matters is it was an interesting limited archetype. At number 2, I have blue-green clues from Shadows over Innistrad with ongoing investigation as the signpost uncommon. This is a pretty cool way to do signpost uncommons, by the way. We've seen it a few times where you have an actual monocolored card, but then it has an activated ability of another color. We really saw this for the first time in the original Innistrad with flashback cards, where you did sort of have these signpost cards before signpost uncommons fully became a thing. But the point here is that this deck was really interesting. I love grindy play styles for the most part. I'll play aggro, of course, and I do in lots of limited formats, especially where you don't have much of a choice. But I love grindy decks that can really grind out a game, and ongoing investigation itself and the clue deck in general was really just amazing. So these clue tokens were artifact tokens that you could pay to and sacrifice to draw a card. So you would get this thing that you could cash in later to draw more cards. And that's a great mechanic for any format, limited format that's not really fast, because you can just, over the time, really overwhelm your opponent, especially when you have a clue engine like ongoing investigation. There was also a bunch of life gain mixed in, like ongoing investigation, so you could really grind out games. This was one of the sweeter, sort of grindy value engine archetypes we've ever seen. Maybe the sweetest of all of them, really, in my estimation, anyway. We haven't really seen a true clue deck come back. We've seen clues come back. I'd really like to see them come back more, especially because we see treasure and food all the time these days. So going with an older artifact token related mechanic would be cool. And then at number 1, I have one that I think was both quite good in the format and also really unique. And I'd love to see it again. And that is black-green -1/-1 counters from Amonkhet. So this was a cool take on a counter deck. Getting a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters. You see that all the time, especially in green-white or in black-green, sometimes in black-white. We see it all the time. What we don't see all the time is a deck that really interestingly puts -1/-1 counters on your stuff for value. And that's what made this color pair so interesting to me. So you had all these creatures like Decimator Beetle that entered the battlefield and put a -1/-1 counter on one of your things. And this could be used in so many different ways. In the case of Decimator Beetle, you have a payoff when you attack with something that has a counter, because you can move one of those counters to something else, which was really powerful to begin with. But you could also do some other interesting things. You could put it on the 2-mana 1/1 that when it dies makes a 2/2 zombie. So you really just end up with really efficient creature. Whether you're playing, there was a 3-mana 4/3 with a lifelink that put a counter on something, a 3-mana 3/4 vanilla, you didn't have anything else going on. But if you could put the counter on something else, you could have a 3/4 and maybe get some value out of the counter. There was like a big -1/-1 counter payoff in the form of Nest of Scarabs. It was just a really cool way to do counters. They've found some other interesting ways to do it of late too. We just saw Brokers, for example, caring about any kind of counter and having shield counters was kind of cool, but it pales in comparison to this, which just felt really unique. And really powerful too. I mean, Decimator Beetle was a super powerful signpost uncommon that would really just decimate your opponent. and having all of these other nice creatures around who could either, you know, put counters on your stuff for value. You know, sometimes you did just have to put it on the one creature, but then your fail case was still, you were getting like a 3-mana 3/2 with lifelink or whatever. So that was really cool design. They designed the cards to be just powerful enough, and they gave you enough payoffs for doing things with those counters that it was a really cool archetype. And I'd like to see it come back again. We haven't seen it yet. I guess maybe if we ever go back to Amonkhet, we'll see it. Maybe a new Phyrexia-related set, which seems to be in our near future, also could introduce a -1/-1 counter archetype, since we already know they like -1/-1 counters and poison and all of that. So yeah, so those are, for me, you know, really in this post-Theros, not post-Theros, but Theros and afterward era of cohesive limited archetypes. These are the 10 that when they showed up, I thought were both powerful and original. Some of them have sort of lost their punch, like Black Red Treasure, because we just keep seeing it over and over again. And so it has sort of faded for me how cool that archetype was. Whereas the ones that are more unique, like that we had at the top of this list, are definitely the cooler ones, just because I really want to see more of them. So that will do it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I think for next week's episode, we'll probably dive into the archetypes of Dominaria United. They'll probably be revealed next week. So we'll start to talk about an upcoming limited format, which will be a lot of fun. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to catch future editions of Nizzanotes and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past editions of Nizzanotes, you should see the playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.